discussion on genetics. When we look at the genetics of an individual, there's two big terms that we care about, the genotype and the phenotype. When we look at someone's genotype, we are looking at the specific genes that they have inherited. Did they inherit the gene that's supposed to make them look good, or the gene that's supposed to make them look bad? And how many copies of that gene did they inherit? When we look at a specific gene, there are different variations of the same gene. I like to think of this as a different flavor of the same gene. So if you go to the ice cream shop downtown, you can order ice cream, but there's more than one kind of ice cream. We could have a Rocky Road or a Maple Nut, so on and so forth. Just like if we look at the genes in our body, there are multiple variations of the same gene that could code for the same trait. For example, if we look at blood type, there are multiple genes that can code for the antigens that appear on the surface of our blood cells. A specific kind of a specific gene, or a specific form of a specific gene, is known as an allele. Alleles of a gene are going to always be located at the same spot on the same chromosome. The location a fit gene is physically located on the chromosome is known as its locus. Typically, when we report the locus or location of a gene on a chromosome, we'll give a large number that refers to how many base pairs in that gene is on the chromosome, and then we'll say chromosome number 3 and give the chromosome number. Now, there are two varieties of alleles that occur most frequently. These are the dominant alleles and the recessive allele for the same gene. Let's talk about, for example, earlobes being attached. There is a gene that causes the earlobe on a person to be attached to the side of their head, and there's another gene that causes that earlobe to be dangly and free hanging. The gene that causes the earlobe to hang down free is typically going to be a dominant gene, or the dominant allele of that gene. The gene that causes the earlobe to be attached is typically referred to as the recessive allele. This simple dominant recessive relationship can be seen in many different traits. For example, a dominant trait in human beings is to have short, stubby fingers. A recessive trait in human beings is to have long, slender fingers. If anyone inherits a dominant allele, they will express the trait coded for by that dominant allele. Now, think back to previous chapters where we talked about mitosis and meiosis. When we look at a human cell, how many copies of the genome is in a human cell? 1 or 2 copies. Are the cells of our bodies haploid or diploid? They are diploid. So if we look at most cells of our body, they are diploid. They have 2 of each chromosome. So when we're looking at these alleles, we need to report 2 alleles for the genotype. This individual has 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele. By convention, we typically use a capital letter to represent the dominant allele and a lowercase letter to represent the recessive allele. Now, I'm often asked, Bob, how do we choose the letter? Should we use a Q or an R or a W? It really is irrelevant what specific letter of the alphabet you choose. Usually, if the trait is for being tall, we'll choose T for tall. Or if it's for black hair, we'll choose B for black hair. So we'll try to choose a letter that's related to the trait, but it doesn't really matter that much. As long as you keep your capitals and your lower cases clearly differentiated from each other. So try to stay away from W, because many students have a tough time handwriting W, capital and lowercase w's to look different from each other. So if we look at this, well, it's an older smartboard here. We have 1 dominant allele for this genotype. Here we have 2 dominant alleles for that genotype. Because there is a dominant allele present for both of those genotypes, the dominant trait is expressed in over or masked over the recessive trait. The only way to have the recessive trait expressed is if the patient or the person has 2 copies of the recessive allele. So in this convention, they would have 2 lowercase t's. Any questions about genotype?
The words gene, allele, and trait seem to be used kind of, like this is dominant gene, male, and recessive allele. Can the recessive allele also be known as a recessive gene? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
So there are different kinds of genotypes we can have. If we have two of the same allele, we are going to be homozygous. If you have two different alleles, you are heterozygous. So if you have two dominant alleles, you're homozygous dominant. If you have two recessive alleles, you're homozygous recessive. And if you have two different alleles, you're just heterozygous. Ashley, why do I not need to say heterozygous dominant recessive? But for the homozygous types, I need to say if it's dominant or recessive. The reason we don't need to say heterozygous dominant recessive is because that would be redundant. By definition, if it's heterozygous, you have two different alleles for the same gene. Conversely, homozygous means that you have two of the same alleles. It's possible to have two dominants or two recessives. So for when you're referring to a homozygous genotype, it's very important to specify homozygous dominant versus homozygous recessive. So let's go back to attached and unattached earlobes. What you can see manifested is typically referred to as the phenotype, or the trait being expressed. So the genotype determines what the phenotype is going to be. The specific alleles of the specific genes that a person has inherited determine what the physical characteristics of that person are going to be. If that person has a genotype that is homozygous dominant for the earlobe being unattached, they will have an unattached earlobe. If that patient or person has a heterozygous genotype for the unattached earlobe, then they have the unattached earlobe. Having an earlobe unattached is a dominant trait. And then finally, if the patient is homozygous recessive for the earlobe being unattached, they will have the recessive phenotype, or the recessive trait, expressed. Generally speaking, when you look at a person, you can know their phenotype because you can see the traits that are expressed. The genotype of the individual is more difficult to deduce. It is possible, especially if you go through breeding programs, to deduce the genotype of individuals. But generally speaking, the best way to get the genotype of the individual is through genetic testing. So, I can look at you right now, and if you have a dominant trait expressed, let's say, for example, your earlobe is hanging down. The phenotype is unattached earlobe. Now, if your earlobe is unattached, what genotype do you have? You could have homozygous dominant, or you could have a heterozygous genotype. We don't know. We would need to collect more information. However, if we look at your ear and see that your earlobe is attached, then we would absolutely know your genotype is homozygous recessive, because there's only one genotype that corresponds to that specific phenotype. Questions? All right. Let's talk about hair color. Hair color is another common dominant recessive trait that we can look at. Black hair is dominant to white, or excuse me, to blonde hair. So if we have an individual that has regular pigmentation to their skin. So at this trait, we're actually looking at albinism, not hair color. If they have one dominant allele from mom and a dominant allele from dad combining for albinoism, that zygote receives two dominant alleles, and that person has a normal phenotype because they received one of the dominant alleles for that phenotype. If mom donates a dominant allele, but dad donates a recessive allele, the dominant allele masks the recessive allele, and the offspring has a normal phenotype. However, if both mom and dad contribute recessive alleles for the gene, the offspring has two recessive alleles and could potentially be albino. They will express the recessive trait. So, if you see an offspring that is albino, you know that offspring's genotype. They are homozygous recessive for that trait. And you also know the parent's genotype. What genotype must the parents have if the parents do not express the trait, but the child does express the homozygous recessive trait? Where do we get our genes from? Or to rephrase the question, who do we get our genetics from? Our mom and our dad. Our parents give us our genetics. Now, if we received a recessive allele from our mom and a recessive allele from our dad, that must mean that our mom and dad have a recessive allele. But if they do not express the trait, what other allele must they also have? The dominant allele. So if a child is born that it has the homozygous recessive allele, and that state is not present in the parents, either of the parents, you know for certain each parent is a heterozygote for that trait. So, here's our first concept check. If we look at different versions of the same gene, we call those what? Dominant, recessive, genotypes, phenotypes, alleles. So, what do we call different versions of the same gene? Help me out here, class. Or different flavors of the same gene. It is correct. D, alleles, is the correct answer. Nicely done, Austin. So let's try to connect the traits we have to what we got from our parents. Now if we look at stubby fingers, short stubby fingers are dominant to long slender fingers. So there are two possible genotypes to give you this one phenotype. On the other hand, long slender fingers are homozygous recessive, or a recessive trait. There's one genotype that gives you that phenotype. In other words, you're more likely to not be a hand model than to be a hand model. And the same is true for freckles as well. The ability to have freckles is a homozygous, or excuse me, is a dominant trait. So there are two genotypes for that one phenotype. On the other hand, having very clear skin is a recessive trait. So not having freckles has one phenotype or one genotype for that one phenotype. Practically speaking, you are more likely to have freckles than not to have freckles. Everything else being equal. So let's make some crosses now. Let's pretend we're breeding mom and dad together. And we'll figure out what is the likelihood of the kiddos having this specific trait. Now, if we have a one trait cross, we are only going to look at the genotype and phenotype for one specific trait, like earlobe being attached, or having freckles, or being albino. We look at one trait at a time. On the other hand, a two trait cross looks at two traits at a time. A four trait cross, well, looks at four traits at a time. These crosses become exponentially more complicated as we add additional traits. One trait crosses are no problem. There are 4 possible outcomes. 2 trait crosses have 16 possible outcomes. 3 trait crosses have 64 possible outcomes. So it's 4 to the nth power in terms of the number of outcomes that can occur. So it becomes very complicated very quickly. Now, if we look at the gametes that we get from mom and dad, what is the maternal gamete known as? What's the female sex cell? Sometimes women will donate these for money. Sometimes they harvest them and freeze them for later. The egg is the female gamete, or the female sex cell. How about the male gamete? The sperm. So when a man or a woman produces a gamete, that gamete is a haploid cell. It contains only 1 copy of the genome. Therefore, it's only going to have 1 copy of the gene, or 1 allele for that trait. So if let's say, here's a generic human being. And this human being is homozygous dominant for the trait, whatever this trait is. Let's say it's for black hair, B for black hair. When they produce a gamete, they can contribute a dominant allele, or they can contribute a dominant allele. They only have dominant alleles to contribute. On the other hand, this other person, they are a heterozygote. They have a dominant and they have a recessive allele. So when they make a gamete, their gamete can have a dominant allele, or their gamete could have a recessive allele. So generally speaking, these crosses are more exciting to do with heterozygotes. When you're working with homozygous crosses, they're much more boring. So, let's say dad does not have freckles. Because dad does not have freckles, he has to be homozygous recessive. That's the only genotype that corresponds to that phenotype. And our homozygous recessive dad has to contribute a recessive allele to his sperm cell. Mom is also freckle-free. She is also homozygous recessive, so she must contribute the recessive allele. And then the kids must inherit 2 copies of the recessive allele. In other words, based on the information on this slide, if a mom and a dad without freckles reproduce, there is a 100% chance that their children will not have freckles. Because the only allele that mom or dad can contribute is a recessive allele. Now, if mom and dad don't have, I should say husband and wife, don't have freckles, but a kiddo is born with freckles, that should make you raise an eyebrow. Because genetically speaking, if mom can't contribute the allele for freckles, and the husband can't contribute the allele for freckles, that strongly implies that the biological father is not the husband. Now, as we go through this process of predicting the likelihood of the outcome of the genotypic and crosses and the phenotypic outcome of the children, we are going to perform what is known as a Punnet square. During the Punnet square, we make a grid that shows us all the possible combinations of all the possible gametes from both mom and dad. Let's make some Punnet squares on the side here. I want you to follow along here. Let's talk about that black hair example again. So we'll say dad has black hair, and since black hair is dominant, Dad can be a heterozygote and still have black hair. Mom, on the other hand, also has black hair. And she is also a heterozygote for black hair. Now, if we look at mom's or dad's alleles over here, dad can contribute a dominant allele to the kid, and dad can contribute a recessive allele to the kid. There are two possible alleles dad can contribute to his gametes. Then the same is true for mom. Mom can contribute either a dominant or a recessive allele to her gametes. So mom's dominant allele can be contributed, or her recessive allele can be contributed. Now, by convention, and this is kind of like grammar rules for Punnett squares, it's nice when you follow them, but it's not necessary to follow them. Generally speaking, dominant alleles are going to be put up and to the left. And recessive alleles, if they are present, are going to be put down or to the right. Now when we do this cross, each of these squares represents a potential child. And since there are 4 potential alleles that can be contributed between mom and dad, we'll end up with a 2 by 2 grid. So there's 4 potential combinations of alleles that the children could have. Mom could contribute a dominant allele, or mom could contribute a recessive allele to her kiddo. On the same token, dad can contribute a dominant allele, or dad can contribute a recessive allele. Now, as we look at these potential genotypes of the kiddos, one potential genotype for the kiddo would be if mom contributed a dominant and dad contributed a dominant. What is this genotype called? Not heterozygous dominant, homozygous dominant. So one potential genotype is homozygous dominant. Another potential genotype is the opposite. It's homozygous recessive. And then potentially the kiddos could be heterozygotes. There are 2 squares that show the heterozygous outcome. In other words, it's twice as likely that the kid will be heterozygous compared to homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. Now, after performing this Punnett square, performing a Punnett square, typically you are going to be asked to report a genotypic and a phenotypic ratio. That's pretty standard. Our genotypic ratio when you write it down, by convention, we go dominant alleles before recessive alleles. So we will have 1 homozygous dominant offspring, because there was 1 square that was homozygous dominant. There are 2 squares that are heterozygotes. So we say 2 heterozygote. And then there's 1 square that is homozygous recessive. We say that there is 1 homozygous recessive genotype. Now, if black hair is dominant to recessive, or to blonde hair, so the black hair is the dominant allele, what hair color would a homozygous dominant have? If black is the dominant trait. Black hair, excellent. And if someone is a heterozygote, what hair color would they have? Black hair, because they have at least 1 copy of the dominant black allele. What about this person over here? They have 2 copies of the recessive allele. They're homozygous recessive. Would they have the dominant black allele? Nope. So they would not have that dominant trait. They would have the recessive trait. They would be a blondie. So when we report the phenotypic ratio, we would say 3 black-haired, 1 blonde hair. In other words, it's possible for 2 parents with black hair to have a blonde-haired offspring. It's unlikely, but it's theoretically possible. Both parents need to be a heterozygote, and if both parents are a heterozygote, there is a 25% chance that each individual or any individual child would have blonde hair. Now, if you just look at somebody like Alyssa over there, she has black hair. I can't tell if you're a heterozygote or a homozygous dominant by just looking at your hair color. So just because a parent that reproduce with black hair is reproducing, we don't know for sure what their genotype is because they're representing the dominant trait. And let's do another Punnett square. Oh, wrong one. So let's say dad is a blondie and mom is also blonde. Dad will have a homozygous recessive genotype. Mom also has a homozygous recessive genotype. When mom is contributing her alleles, she can either contribute a recessive allele or a recessive allele. When dad is contributing his alleles, it can be a recessive allele or a recessive allele. These are pretty boring Punnett squares. So when you fill them in, when you have two homozygous recessive individuals reproducing, your genotypic ratio is going to be 4 of that phenotype, or genotype. And then the phenotypic ratio is also 4 blonde. Sometimes instead of just giving the ratios, you'll see percentages given. So you could say 100% homozygous recessive, 100% blonde. And to go back to the previous example, I could say 25% homozygous dominant, 50% heterozygous, 25% homozygous recessive, 75% black, 25% blonde. Now, if two blonde-haired parents reproduce, and the kiddo has black hair, should you raise an eyebrow? Absolutely. Why should you raise an eyebrow, Ashley?
Not if it's an adult.
We'll assume the kiddo naturally has black hair. Yes, you should absolutely raise an eyebrow. Obviously, if they choose to override their phenotypic trait with some external source, you can't use simple genetics to determine paternity. So here's another example that was given for the freckle example. These are two heterozygotes reproducing. Whenever you have a heterozygote crossing with another heterozygote, you will always get the 1-to-1 genotypic ratio and the 3-to-1 phenotypic ratio. That's classic for a double heterozygote cross. Our genotypic ratios are always the number of offspring or the ratio of or percentage of the offspring with that genotype. And conversely, with the phenotypic ratio, it's the number or the percentage of that offspring with that specific phenotype. Any questions on how to do a one-trait cross? How about reporting genotypic or phenotypic ratios? All right, let's move on. Monohybrid crosses are boring. Let's do a dihybrid cross, a two-trait cross. So instead of 4 potential outcomes, we'll have 16 potential outcomes. Those are much more exciting. Let's first look at the process of meiosis. If you have 2 different traits, you're going to have 2 different genes, and with different alleles. And for a 2-trait cross, there are more possibilities for those gametes. You can have 2 dominant alleles be passed on by mom, Mom can pass on two recessive alleles for the two different traits. Mom could do a dominant and a recessive, or a dominant and a recessive. So for these traits, for these two trait crosses, there are 4 potential gametes from mom and 4 potential gametes from dad. Let's do one as a class. So let's say dad has black hair and is albino. Mom, actually, that's a contradiction. Dad, we'll say, is a heterozygote for albinoism. Mom, on the other hand, can you tell I'm making these up on the fly? Because obviously if they have black hair, they can't be albino. Or bright white. And mom has blonde hair, and she's also an albino heterozygote. Now when I say heterozygote, what does that mean? Does that mean that they are expressing the recessive trait?
Yeah. Well,
Nope.
like it's one of both, right?
Yes, they'll have one of each, a dominant and a recessive allele. So when someone's heterozygous for a recessive trait, they are called a carrier for that trait. They have the genetic potential to pass that on to their offspring, but they as an individual do not express that recessive phenotype. Yes, you do. You have to have a recessive allele from mom and a recessive allele from dad.
So their gametes pass on the negative one?
Yes. So, dad, we're arbitrarily going to call a homozygous dominant for hair color, and then for albinoism, he is a heterozygote. Mom is blonde hair, so we know she is homozygous recessive for blonde hair, and she's also a heterozygote for albinoism. All right, let's mix and match some alleles now. I'm going to do male gametes in green. So dad could pass on a recessive or dominant for the two traits. Dad could pass on a dominant recessive, a recessive dominant, or a recessive recessive for his two traits. Because dad is heterozygous for both traits, there are 4 different possible alleles he could pass on. How are we doing so far?
Sorry, it's going down.
This is a lot of math.
Yes, sir.
We could model this with some quadratics if you'd like.
No.
Now mom, on the other hand, she is going to be in red. She is homozygous for blonde hair. She can only pass on the recessive blonde allele. So regardless of the allele or the gamete, it will absolutely have the recessive blonde allele. But mom is a heterozygote for albinoism. So half of her alleles will have the dominant allele, and then half of her gametes have the dominant allele. Half of her gametes have the recessive allele. These are possibilities.
Okay.
Just because mom and dad have 2 different phenotypes for 2 different traits doesn't mandatorily mean that they will have 16 children.
Yeah.
But we're just trying to find the predicted chances of an individual child having a specific genotype or a specific phenotype. So when we look at what dad can contribute, he can contribute dominance, he can contribute heterozygosness, And then mom can contribute her gamete as well. So when you perform a 2-trait cross, it becomes 4 times more complicated than a 1-trait cross. And we could spend a lot of time breaking this apart and coming up with our genotypic and phenotypic ratios. And I don't want to dedicate that kind of class time to that. So let's look at one that was from your textbook, where they did the math for us. We have a dihybrid cross for someone who is homozygous dominant for both traits and homozygous recessive for both traits. Those are easier crosses to perform because there's fewer possible gametes that can be produced. And in this scenario, where we have the 2-trait cross, we find that there's a lot less variation for the gametes that can be made if they're both homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. Now, if they're both homozygous recessive, or they're homozygotes for the same trait, there's only one gamete that can be produced. A gamete that contains either the homozygous dominant allele or the homozygous recessive allele. It's when we introduce those heterozygotes that things become much more complicated. For your lecture exam, I want you to be able to do genotypic phenotypic ratios for a monohybrid cross. I will not ask you to do a dihybrid cross on your lecture exam. Potentially as an extra credit, but not for a typical exam question. Sex comes into play with the sex chromosomes that are passed on. There are 2 sex chromosomes. What are the 2 sex chromosomes? It's an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. That is a gene on the sex chromosome, particularly on the Y chromosome. The SRY gene is always dominant, and it's almost always on the Y chromosome. There's a very incredibly small chance the SRY region can be put onto a chromosome other than the Y chromosome, but that is the exception, not the norm. And when I say a very small chance, I mean less than 1%. Nope, not a hermaphrodite. That's someone who's XX genetically, but develops phenotypically as a male. So if we have 2 monohybrid heterozygotes crossing with each other, we get a 3-to-1 phenotypic ratio, dominant to recessive. If we have a monohybrid heterozygote with a homozygote, you get a 1-to-1 dominant recessive relationship. When you have dihybrid heterozygous crosses, you ultimately end up with 9 dominants for both traits, 3 dominant for trait A, 3 dominant for trait B, and then 1 homozygous recessive for both traits. So if you see a 9-3-3-1 phenotypic ratio, that is a big red flag that you are working with a dihybrid heterozygote cross. Because if we take, and we total this up, 9 plus 1 plus 3 plus 3 gives us those 16 potential outcomes for that 4x4 grid that we put together. And then if you have a 1-1-1-1 for your phenotypic, that means that you have a dihybrid where you have a heterozygote for both traits for one parent and a homozygote recessive for both traits for the other parent. So, if you perform a cross and dad is a heterozygote and mom is a homozygote, what genotypic ratio can you expect, particularly if mom is homozygous recessive? And this is a monohybrid cross. So dad is a heterozygote for the trait. Dad can contribute a dominant or a recessive allele. Mom is a homozygous recessive. She can contribute a recessive or a recessive. What would the genotypic ratio be? Let's go ahead and fill this in. That'll make it a little bit easier. So how many heterozygous offspring are there? What was that? Yes, the correct answer is E. There are 2 heterozygotes and 2 homozygous recessives. So E is our correct answer. And we'll go ahead and stop our recording right now.